Rory Stewart and Alastair Campbell, the twin elephants in the room.
Tweedledad and centrist Tweedledee.
I've watched again the appearance that you made in November. There were some clips that I thought it would be useful to look at.
How much time have you spent in Israel, in the West Bank?
5 or 6 times now.
Can I ask a sort of mean question?
Of course.
Is there a possibility that there's a problem here?
Yes.
Of slight intellectual self-confidence and an absence of understanding that there are areas you know less about than others. Michael, you don't really need to give me a lecture on the history of Israel.
No, but I have to explain. For those people who are not watching the podcast but listening to it, they will have missed the fact that at the point that Rory talks about easy intellectual overconfidence, that Alastair Campbell is suppressing a smirk. And I think Alastair is probably thinking, come on, Rory, you're the master of this. Britain has been less effective at dealing with Islamist fundamentalism and extremism than they have been, and that the Muslim Brotherhood, banned in the United Arab Emirates, is operating freely within the UK.
And I suppose the question is, why is it so anathema for the centrist dads to discuss this? What is it about their worldview that makes this a racist conversation?
Yeah, I think, again, you can't know precisely, but I think that part of it is.
Hello, and thank you for joining us on The Brink. I'm Jake Wallace-Simons.
And I'm Andrew Fox. With the shock, sacking and defection of Robert Jenrick to Reform, this week we're exploring the slow collapse of the centrist dad consensus, the rise of new parties, and where all this is going.
And who better to do this than the former Tory minister, Michael Gove, now editor of The Spectator. Back in November, Lord Gove received a battering on Rory Stewart and Alastair Campbell's The Rest is Politics podcast, the ultimate in centrist daddism. And we've been meaning to ask Michael about the experience.
Before we begin the conversation, on Monday we'll be recording our first ever live episode of The Brink at JW3 in North London, joined by Rachel Riley and Brendan O'Neill. It has sold out. More tickets have been released, but there aren't very many. So grab one of the last few tickets at the JW3 website and join us on Monday.
If you're enjoying our podcast, as ever, don't forget to like, subscribe, share it, and leave a comment. We love to know what you think. And if you're listening on audio, give the podcast 5 stars.
Finally, this January, we are offering a subscription to The Brink with the first month absolutely free. Sign up at thebrinkpodcast.substack.com/New Year Trial. And now, without further ado, we present Michael Gove on The Brink.
Michael Gove, thank you for joining us on The Brink.
Hi, it's a pleasure.
First of all, Robert Jenrick.
Yes.
News broke recently. We're recording Thursday afternoon. Jenrick's just been sacked by Kemi Badenoch and has now joined Reform. What are your initial thoughts?
Well, I was as taken aback as anyone. I think it's the case that anyone who's a political commentator, as I now am, and an ex-politician, should naturally say, well, of course, I saw this coming. I didn't. And I'm disappointed overall with Robert. I worked with him.
But there were rumours, weren't there?
There were many rumours.
Last couple of weeks.
There have been all sorts of rumours about defections, whether it was Rob himself or others. Our political editor, Tim Shipman, had raised the question about whether or not Rob might defect alongside Jack Rankin, the MP for Windsor, and others. Jack Rankin wrote to The Spectator saying, absolutely not. I didn't think that Rob would. Of course, after the event, it's not shocking because everyone knew that he had a sense of unhappiness, both having been defeated for the leadership of the Conservative Party and with the positions that Kemi had taken on some issues. But, before this, I had assumed that he would have thought that it was better to join his fortunes with the rest of the Tory leadership and to make the case for the party and its policies. But I can understand why his sense of disaffection drove him to Reform, but I think it's a pity for him. I also think that by preempting that move in straightforward political terms, that Kemi's won the upper hand.
I mean, rightly or wrongly, people often associate you with this idea of betrayal.
Yes.
Do you, looking at Jenrick, do you feel something of what he's going through, his experiences, given your past
again,
knifing of Boris and other things?
People will look the decisions of any politician through the prism of what does it mean for them, what does it mean for their personal ambition. Again, every politician is a mixture of the personal and the principled. And you can't really know without knowing someone deep down to what extent their actions are motivated by principle, patriotism, altruism, and to what extent it's a matter of calculation and or ambition. And you can't make windows of men's souls. Earlier this week, when Nadim Zahawi defected to Reform, lots of people saw that through the prism of personal ambition, his allegedly thwarted hopes of a peerage, and so on. I'm not in a position to make those judgments. So I think you just have to see how someone, after they've made a decision like this, behaves and form your own judgment.
Yeah. With your political spidey sense, obviously that's two pretty big defections in a week. Is there a danger of floodgates opening, do you think?
I don't think so, because I think, funnily enough, the Nadim defection and the Rob defection have actually made it more difficult, because both the reaction to Nadim's defection, which was, I think, less universally, delighted amongst Reform's ranks, and the criticism that he got from fellow Conservatives.
The thwarted peerage attempts and all that stuff.
Precisely.
Yeah.
I think that he seemed slightly tarnished and shop-soiled as a result. Within Reform, there was a fear that the party was becoming a laundry for shop-soiled Conservatives. Rob, of course, is different. He's a sitting MP. He's in the shadow cabinet. He's someone whose political career would have been thought to have been ahead of him, not behind him. And therefore, objectively, of course, it's much bigger potatoes. However, the fact that his move was preempted by Kemi in just in terms of sheer political manoeuvring means that it looks less seemly and less adroit overall. A lot will rest now on the dynamic within Reform as to whether or not it's seen as actually a net coup for Nigel Farage overall. Related to that is the positioning of Reform overall in the eyes of voters. Yeah. So if Reform's appeal has been very much that they're a new group, that they're untainted by the failures of the establishment, if it seems that they become a top-heavy ex-establishment movement, then it's the case that they're so diluted that the original Reform brand no longer has the potency it might have done.
In terms of, Kemi seems to me to have played rather a blinder.
Yes.
Her, Jenrick and Farage, who do you think is the winner at this point?
At this point, I think it is Kemi. So Farage was blindsided, and even in the two press conferences that he's given today, one in Scotland and then one this afternoon with Rob Jenrick, this Thursday afternoon, he coped with his usual bonhomie. But it was clear that this was not something that he'd anticipated. It wasn't on his grid. He was not the master of events. And from Kemi's point of view, ever since she won the leadership, Rob has been the alternative pole of loyalty within the Conservative Party. That's now gone. Ordinarily, you wouldn't think that losing one of the most talented members of the shadow cabinet was something to crow about. But if you are in a game of kill or be killed, and the inevitable comparisons with BBC TV One's Traitors come to mind, it is better to be the one doing the banishing than to be the one murdered.
Yeah. But I suppose in the longer run, Kemi will be without Jenrick, which is a big hole in her party. Yes. And Farage will have him. It feels like a bigger loss for Kemi than it is a gain for Reform somehow.
I know exactly what you mean. So, again, one of the challenges for Farage is, as he assembles his alternative team, there will be questions about who is the real number 2 or 3 in the party. And it may well be the case that, just in personality terms, people like Richard Tice and Zia Youssef, who've been Farage long marchers and true believers, might think, well, it's all very well having Rob Jenrick join us, but
and Zia and Jenrick had a row.
Oh, yeah, they did.
In August.
Yeah. So the who is top dog or deputy dog in Reform will be a question. Zia Youssef, who's never been in the Tory party, unlike Richard Tice, has been scabrous about the Tories, and he's been very critical of Rob Jenrick over the question of Afghan interpreters coming to the UK. Big story last year. He's also been critical of Rob over the failure when he was immigration minister to deal properly with asylum. Rob's defenders would say, well, he resigned on principle because he wasn't getting his way. But nevertheless, it's not a nest of singing birds in that respect. And there's another challenge for reform, which is as it shapes its policy agenda, where does Rob's particular flavour of conservatism or right-wingery fit within the reform constellation? For Kemi, yes, she's definitely lost someone who was one of her most effective media operators and a skilled parliamentary operator. But the person that she's replaced Rob with, Nick Timothy, is someone whose star has definitely been in the ascendant. He is the person more than anyone in Parliament who's pursued the Chief Constable of West Midlands Police over the grotesque mishandling of the Aston Villa Maccabi Tel Aviv match.
Yeah, and I thought, it's always good to have another former Brink guest, as Nick is.
Yes,
elevated to greatness. I think it's really interesting that Jenrick's he's almost been operating independently for the last year. It's been a very clear thing. He's been doing his own social media videos. His own kind of brand has been out there.
Yeah.
How do you think that will integrate with the sort of the Farage show? Because it's very much top down, isn't it?
It's a very good question because, again, you're absolutely right. The modus vivendi within the Tory party had been, okay, Rob, you are both the Shadow Justice spokesperson and, you're junior to Kemi, but the modus vivendi was, we'll cut you a bit of slack. You range freely over other areas. There were other people in the Shadow Cabinet who did not like that, but it was sort of acknowledged that he'd sort of earned the right, both as a strong challenger in the leadership election and as someone who, had his own following to, stray further away from his core brief than others. And he did it very effectively. Now, for Kemi, both dealing with Rob in this way and him no longer being around the table means that she should have a firmer grip on the team, and there'll be people in that team who will be pleased, such is the way of politics, to see Rob go because some of the limelight that would have been his is now theirs. And for Farage, there is that question as well. He absolutely will want to project the strength of a team in depth, but the whole history of his involvement with politics is he's the star. He's Julius Caesar. And you can be a trusted centurion, but there is no way that you are clambering into the victor's chariot with him. He's the guy who gets to wear the laurel wreath, not anyone else.
And there's no Brutus.
No. Well, not at the moment.
Remember, Nigel, thou art mortal.
Yes. Well, I think no one has that job in reform. Well, it's always remember, Nigel, you are semi-divine. So.
Goodness me, that escalated so quickly. We wanted to talk about centrist dads.
Yes.
And it feels like the, I don't know if we call it a fall of Jenrick, the move of Jenrick from the Tories to this insurgent disruptive party feels emblematic of the further collapse of the old centrist dad establishment. Would you count yourself as a former member of the centrist dads, or a current member of the centrist dads, or an anti-centrist dad?
No, some of my best friends are centrist dads, but I would not say that I was. No, I have some views that for someone who's a Tory might be considered to be left-wing on some economic questions. But because of that, it's not the case that I'm a split the difference centrist person. I certainly don't think that I am. I've got Tory instincts in most areas, and also I dislike the smuggery that you associate with centrist dads.
Yeah, I think that's a fair one. We'll talk about the smugness as we go through this.
Speaking of which,
we're going to look at some intense smugness shortly.
Yes.
I think it's an interesting phenomenon, though, because is centre even a thing anymore? Because we have this insurgent party on the right, insurgent parties on the left, both your party and the Greens, and these seem to be gathering momentum and steam. We're looking at the polls. Labour are tanking, Conservatives are tanking. Is there even a centre anymore?
Well, again, you're right, because the centre is often defined as the midpoint between left and right. But my friend Dominic Cummings has made the point often in the past that is often taken to mean that that voters who might move from left to right are somehow poised equidistant between the two in a sort of Lib Dem land where they are splitting the difference between the two, and they are clustering around, this social democratic position, and that they are generally pro-European and in favor of, a sort of Scandi style approach towards policy. The point he makes is that swing voters historically tend to have views which are to the left of the establishment on economics and to the right of the establishment on questions like law and order. As Dom said, the classic view of a swing voter is save the NHS, hang the pedos. And the sense then that centre and swing voters are different things has, I think, generally been true for years now. But also, the centre has shifted. Whether you use that hackneyed phrase, the Overton window, or you deploy another way of describing it, where the centre ground has changed. One of the points that was made in the discussion about the Labour Party's future leadership and the question over Keir Starmer is that Shabana Mahmood's views on migration, which are anathema to many Labour members, and which would have been considered, if articulated by anyone 5 years ago, to be right-wing, are actually shared by a majority of voters for every party, including the Greens and Labour. So on migration, what you might consider to be the centre position, wherever you start out, has moved undeniably. And also there are external events, we might go on to these, which mean that many of the assumptions that centrist dads would have had about how the world should be ordered and how it should behave have been completely upended.
In the last 12 months.
Totally.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like the few centrist dad bastions that are clinging on are really beyond their time. It feels to me like the tide's gone out and they're still there thinking that it hasn't happened.
Yes.
And we're going to go on to a couple of those in a moment. But just before we do, that note about, you said that most voters want to say the NHS, hang the pedos. If we add to that, get the migrants out.
Yes.
Or burn the hotel or stop the boats or whatever it is, that's the Farage reform position now.
Well,
left on the economy, right on social issues.
This is one of the interesting questions. So the whole question about where reform are on the economy is, I find it fascinating. And I think it's also, at the moment, I don't want to say confused, but certainly unclear. There have been indications from Team Farage that they would take a more left-wing position. So when they've been talking about things like water companies, railways, big business and so on.
Child benefit cap.
Yeah, exactly. There is a more populist tinge to it. But then at the same time, they're also talking about a smaller state. They've been talking about tax cuts, certainly, waiting before they're implemented in order to make sure that the books are balanced, but still.
UK Doge.
Precisely. And Rob Jenrick has, maybe doing him a disservice, but everything about his positioning has been, broadly right on the economy. So, we wait to see. I don't want to condemn before we know more, but you are right that if you look at continental populist parties, they are emphatically more, whether it's, Bardella and Le Pen in France or the AfD in Germany, they're definitely a combination of slightly more interventionist on the economy, slightly more welfare certainly for those that they would deem to be deserving contributors, and again, much more robust or hawkish on crime, migration, and social issues.
Yeah, and we see this phenomenon on the left where it's almost a Corbynite position that the Greens are adopting in many ways. And they're providing direct competition with your party. That's what they're still calling it.
Yeah.
We're also seeing what you might call, I suppose, Islamic populism.
Yes.
We have 4, potentially 5, if you include Corbyn MPs who are elected on a Gaza ticket. How much do you think that's going to impact the next election?
Hugely, and it's impossible to know yet quite how it will turn out. I'm fascinated by this area. And I think so far, at The Spectator, we've tried to understand it, I think probably with more coverage than most other titles, But at the same time, it is a complex picture. So we had a look at your party last year, late last year, at this sort of Islamic left alliance. But then one of the your party MPs, a guy called Adnan Hussein, who's the MP for Blackburn, wrote a very articulate letter. I obviously profoundly disagree with his views on Middle Eastern questions and integrationist questions, but it was clear that he was, by his own lights, a thoughtful social conservative whose views on questions like education and gender were very different from someone like Zara Sultana, with whom he'd been bracketed within your party. Beyond that, the situation within Britain's Muslim community is fascinating because even before the Gaza war, you had a sense of exasperation on the part of some Muslim voters with Labour, and that's grown partly as a result of foreign policy, but partly also because on some domestic questions as well, like the response to trans rights, there's a cleavage between what many pious Muslim voters believe in and what the default position of many Labour activists and MPs might be.
That's right. Well, on that note, it might be quite a good idea to start talking about Rory Stewart and Alastair Campbell, the twin elephants in the room. I thought that
centrist Tweedledad and centrist Tweedledee.
I mean, that was kind. You could have gone with centrist Tweedledum, but you didn't, and I think that's very gentlemanly of you, in fairness.
I thought that. So I've watched again the appearance that you made in November, which was the instigation for this discussion.
Yeah.
And there were some clips that I thought it would be useful to look at, to put us in the same frame and to think about your response to. The first one, of course. Have you watched it back?
I have not watched it back.
Okay. Have you seen any of the clips that were floating around?
No, I enjoyed the conversation, and again, I think not everyone likes it. I do enjoy their podcast for all sorts of reasons, and I think that they're interesting guys. But I also, as I think that podcast revealed, I also think that there are some of the assumptions lying behind their questions and worldview that I certainly don't share.
And you were reluctant to go on it?
No, I was invited to go on their podcast in the past when I was a serving politician, but I didn't think that either they or the listener would get much value out of it. Okay. But now that I'm a retired politician, very ex, I was very happy to go on.
Okay, because they said at the end that you were reluctant to go on.
Oh, initially, yes. Right. That's when I was in the oldie political days.
Right.
Well, they were in many ways magnificently rude about you.
Well, I don't mind
I have
that.
to say, I thought your restraint at some of the questions was quite admirable.
Well,
I'm not sure I'd have shown the same.
On that note, I mean, this one, for example.
How much time have you spent in Israel, in the West Bank, in Gaza? I mean, how much do you actually know about this region? So what worries me, obviously, listening to you, I think, spent a lot of my life working in that region.
Yes, of course.
And when I was in Parliament, I avoided taking pro-Arab or pro-Israeli positions when you were right in there.
Yes.
How much time have you spent in the region?
I think I've been to Israel and the West Bank 5 or 6 times now.
And for how long at a time in the West Bank? Do you spend the night there?
I have never been overnight in the West Bank. I've spent days there. I've visited Ramallah. I've talked to people in the Fatah political leadership. I've talked to people in Palestinian civil society.
So you've been there for
I've talked to Palestinian academics.
You've been there for a few hours. You've been there maybe 20, 30 hours?
I would say, that would probably be. I would say more than that, but not much more than that.
Okay, so 20, 30 hours. So if I said I've been to Manchester on 5 occasions, and I've met some of the leaders, and I'm now going to make Manchester my big issue, and I'm going to have very strong views on Manchester, and I'm going to... Would people not say, what the hell do you think you're doing? You've spent 5 days on the ground. You don't know anything about it.
Well, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, that Rory Stewart spent very much time in Israel, Gaza and the West Bank. I think his time was spent in Afghanistan, Pakistan.
Iraq.
He spent a fair amount of time in Jordan. But there are 2 things I'd say. The first
is the East Bank, not the West Bank.
That this is an attempt to do the old thing. I mean, it's a perfectly legitimate debating tactic, which is the ad hominem argument, so that you attempt to say the people should believe you because you haven't been there or because of something you said in the past, rather than taking on the argument. So you can, I think, take a view on someone's claim to expertise on the basis of deep immersion in a subject, but look at the quality of their argument, because it's in the quality of their argument you can determine whether through conversation, study, lived experience, and observation, their argument merits being taken on. The second thing is, it is very often the case that those people who talk most loudly about their expertise are the people who are proven wrong again and again and again. I have been around the world nowhere near as much as Peter Ricketts, the former National Security Advisor to the British government, who now sits in the House of Lords. I'll tell you this. I think that more of the things that I've said about foreign affairs have proven to be right, and more of my judgments on everything from Brexit to Trump have proven to be right than Peter Ricketts. But there's no doubt that he's much more experienced than me, and his CV looks better. Probably unfair on Peter as an individual. I'm just taking him as a representative. Then the third thing, and I'll stop, is I was listening, certainly with some benefit actually, to Rory and Alastair discussing Trump's intervention in Venezuela. They did an immediate podcast within hours of the event, and actually it was genuinely enjoyable listening. I don't think Rory has spent much time in the streets of Caracas talking to the social movements that constitute the Bolivarian Revolution, but he still had something to add. Why? Because he spent some time in the intelligence service as a diplomat, and he's got a good brain. Not that his conclusions are necessarily ones that I agree with, but he's worth listening to. So, it was a debating technique that Rory deployed with his twinkly-eyed charm, but I also think that it was a diversion from the genuine questions that one might want to debate about Israel, the Middle East, peace process, and so on.
I mean, if you need to know a good Airbnb next time you're in Ramallah, I can give you some recommendations. But I think it's worth asking, why did you go into bat so hard for Israel?
Well, for a long time, I have been sympathetic to Israel's position, and there are a number of overlapping reasons for that. So I think I mentioned on the Rory and Alastair podcast that I grew up in the Church of Scotland, not quite at the same time, but when it was still the Church of Scotland that was recognisable from Gordon Brown's own upbringing. And there was a very strong identification at that time, not now, between the Church's teachings and the Jewish people and the story of the people of Israel, and a natural sympathy. Put religion to one side. Later, when I was a journalist in the 90s, I was very struck by the arguments that were being made in favour of the peace process. And they struck me at the time as victim blaming. Munich is overused as an historical comparison, but just because something is a cliche and it's overused, it doesn't mean that it's completely inaccurate.
There's probably a good reason it's a cliche in many cases.
Quite. And the whole point of the original peace process, and we're talking more than 20 years ago, was basically land for peace. And it was basically appeasement of an aggressor in order to secure a peace settlement. And I thought, this is wrong. The more that I've looked at the topic, and indeed visited Israel, but not just visited Israel, also looked at what's been happening in European countries as well, the more it seems to me, as both of you have pointed out, that the fate of Israel, the condition of Zion, is as much about the West as it is about territory in the Middle East. It is as much a civilizational struggle as it is about territory in the Levant. And once you understand that or take that view, then you can see that hostility, modern-day hostility towards Israel, is a mutation of past anti-Semitism, and that it is an attempt by some on the left, some on the right, by those who are drawn towards conspiracy theories overall, to attack the virtues and the principles that we understand by Western civilization. Now, I can unpack that, but it seems to me, therefore, that if you are defending Israel and you are worried about what happens in European countries towards its Jewish community, you are not taking part in an intra-ethnic struggle in the Middle East. You are concerned with a broader fight for civilized values.
Someone really ought to write a book about that.
Yeah. Well, we'll come on to that in a second. But now might actually be a time to look at another 1 minute long clip.
Yes.
Which is just following that discussion, which is this.
Michael, you don't really need to give me a lecture on the history of Israel.
No, but I have to explain that it is the single freest and most impressive jurisdiction.
The single freest and most impressive jurisdiction.
From Morocco to Delhi. And you have to ask, well, why has that happened? But also, why does it inspire such strong feelings? So when I was at the Labour Party conference, I asked Owen Jones why he spent all his time criticising Israel and didn't show any concern for Sudan or for what was happening in Xinjiang.
And could it possibly be that Sudan is not presented as our central ally? That Sudan is not a country that the United States has been providing billions of dollars of direct military support to?
How did you keep your cool?
Well, again, I think it's always important when you're engaged in what I think is a genuinely important debate to try your best to present facts, or at the very least to lay out your own case. And the point that I've always sought to make is, of course, Israel can't be any more than any other country can be exempt from criticism. Countries are led by human beings. Human beings make mistakes. Political leaders at all times are prone not just to error, but to ego. However, firstly, it is an objective fact that from Morocco to Delhi, there is no jurisdiction which is freer or whose contribution to, scientific innovation, to material prosperity, to supporting other countries through international development has been greater than Israel's.
And if Rory Stewart had spent more time there, he might have recognised that fact.
And the other thing also is that when you find yourself with people who are critical of Israel, they have an interchangeable set of reasons as to why they might be critical. We have every right to expect more, and yet they're prepared to give a free pass to other countries. So, and Andrew, you may take this amiss, but one of the things that always struck me is that there's been even stronger criticism of the IDF in its operation in dealing with, the work of dealing with terrorists in built-up urban areas. More criticism of them than there has been either of the British or American armed forces when they were operating in really tough circumstances, in Iraq especially. Now, that's not to diss the guys whom you served alongside or American armed forces. It's just there seems to be a vehemence directed towards the IDF. Those guys make mistakes. They're, in some cases, 19-year-old kids under amazing pressure. And if they do the wrong thing, of course, and they are, they should face the consequences. But you get Bob Villan in front of cheering crowds of thousands saying death, death to the IDF, and it's a virus, and I think it's worth analysing why that virus has taken hold. And the point that I was trying to make about Sudan, and one could make it, I think, this week with even greater force about Iran, is the selectivity. So it's again, it's perfectly possible that someone might take a sort of Quaker pacifist view that is opposed to, countries that are overly militarized. But if that's so, then you should be just as vehement. Well, you should be more vehement about what's happening in Tehran now than you ever were about what was happening in Gaza. But I can't think of anyone who was full-throatedly critical of Israel during the Gaza conflict who's been equally as critical of the Iranian regime and sympathetic to the protesters. I'm sure there are one or two people, who got that exemplary equality of justice, but not many.
And no offense taken, and I actually completely agree with you. And, my day job is as a conflict analyst, and I've spent 2 years writing exactly that.
Yeah.
And I've just published 20,000 words on how the IDF fought in Gaza. And my principle has always been write about them as if I was writing about the British Army or the American Army or the Dutch or the Sri Lankan Army or whoever. Just an equal lens with fair criticism and also praise where due. And that seems to have been completely absent from this war, where a degree of perfection is expected from the IDF that's not applied to any other military on the planet.
No. Yeah. I mean, the bit that jumped out for me, if I can indulge a hobby horse for a moment, is where you said the clear fact that Israel was the freest jurisdiction from Morocco to wherever it was. And Rory's response was the free of what? As in, like, what are you talking about? It's clear, he was almost treating you as if you were a simpleton in that view.
Yes.
And it reminded me of an encounter more than a year ago now between Rory and Sam Harris, which began with a podcast, which I mention in my book, actually, if I can just refer to it so I can get the words right. So in this podcast, so Sam Harris was trying to get Rory to explore the reason behind the link between Muslim extremists, particularly Muslim extremists, and suicide bombing and terrorism. Why does that phenomenon occur? And Rory just refused to make that connection at all. He said that Vietnamese, Jews, Hindus, and Buddhists had also been violent. That Germans killed themselves after Hitler died, and that this is a quote, effective armies, great militaristic nations are full of young men in particular who are comfortable dying. He said these phenomena are much broader, they're not limited to Muslims, and just refused to be drawn into a discussion of why this phenomenon clearly exists. Even a child could see that. And he even then later compared himself, his adventures in Iraq, going from graduating from Oxford to governing a province in Iraq, to Jihadi John leaving Queen's Park and going off to Syria. And he said that it was a combination of adventure, excitement, idealism, and missionary zeal. That's Act 1. Now, Act 2, there's an Act 3. Act 2 was a few weeks later. I was listening to Sam's podcast again, and Rory Stewart was back on the podcast. And I want to play you what happened, because it's only about 2 minutes. And this is what occurred.
You came on my podcast a few weeks ago, and I thought we had a great conversation. And then afterwards, a listener surfaced some remarks that you made on your own podcast, which I'll drop in here for listeners about, 60 seconds or so.
One of the things that I've noticed recently, particularly since October the 7th, is an increase in people making stereotypical comments about Muslims. I just did an interview with an American podcast, a guy called Sam Harris, who was hammering me for nearly an hour saying, yes, but surely, Rory, you have to admit there's a connection between Muslims and suicide bombers and Muslims and terrorists. He just wouldn't let it go. And I wondered, is that something that you've experienced, and is it something that's getting better, getting worse? How does our society deal with it?
I think it's getting worse. Maybe it comes in cycles.
You were speaking with Humza Yousaf, who's a Scottish politician who happens to be Muslim. I was surprised that you seemed to form the opinion that I was bigoted against Muslims as people. There's really no way for me to understand what you were saying to Humza that doesn't entail my being a regrettable example of what he called Islamophobia. From my point of view, the worst implication is that you think or seem to think that any special focus on Islam as a system of ideas and any special concern about how these ideas produce violence and intolerance is in itself a sign of bigotry.
Sure, Sam. Well, let me begin by apologizing.
It just seems to me as if that sentiment was reflected in his conversation with you, whereby it's a sort of moral relativism. You can't say that Israel is the freest and most liberal country, for all its flaws, in the Middle East because you can't in some way acknowledge the value of some qualities over others, and that, you know, the Islamic world has its own strengths that we're overlooking somehow.
Yes, I'm not sure what was in Rory's mind when he expressed his exasperation with me. And maybe he thought I was oversimplifying. Maybe he thought I was plain wrong. Maybe he thought, as you point out, that this statement was explicitly or implicitly disrespectful. I think the broader point that you raise is also very important. So, because I have a religious faith myself, I have, and maybe other reasons as well, an innate respect for Islam, and I'm curious about religious belief, what draws people towards it, the impact that it has on ethics and society. So I am both curious and respectful, I hope, towards Islam itself. That's why I draw a distinction, and some people criticize me for this from either side, between Islam and Islamism. And again, you know, for the avoidance of doubt, Islamism is a specific political ideology that is to Islam as Marxism is to socialism, say, and, you know, there are particular Islamist thinkers. But whether or not you agree with me drawing that distinction, or anyone else drawing that distinction, it must be the case that it is legitimate to look at Islam as a belief system, to subject it to criticism, if you will, and to generalize without being accused of being motivated by wickedness, and without people automatically assuming that there is a malevolent agenda in your heart. That's why this week, I think it was striking that Kishwar Faulkner, herself a British Muslim who was a Liberal Democrat peer and the head of the Equality and Human Rights Commission in this country, came out against a UK government definition of Islamophobia, because while she obviously has herself at times in the past been the victim of prejudice, she absolutely wants to make sure that we don't create barriers to a proper debate about religion and culture.
Yeah, I mean, these are questions that we've gone into in some depth, and we had a conversation with Tom Tugendhat about this, long chat with Ed Hussein. I mean, we share, both of us, I think I can speak, share your position about dividing Islamism and jihadism from mainstream Islam. But I think we still need to be able to articulate that terrorism, although it's not unique to Islam by any stretch of the imagination, there's a particular problem within the Muslim world that gives rise to Islamism, jihadism, because we can't name it, we can't do anything about it. And in my, like when I talked about Act 3, what I in my mind was the example of Kyle Lawler, who was the young man, the security guard in the Manchester Arena during the bombing that Salman Abedi came in and blew the place up, killing 22 people in 2017, and who saw this young Muslim-looking man walking in under the weight of a heavy backpack, said to himself, he looks suspicious, I can't do anything because I'm being Islamophobic, because to draw a connection between someone who looks Muslim and suicide bombing is verboten Islamophobic. So that's where that sort of centrist ideology becomes more sinister, in my view.
So if the greater sin is a thought crime than a real crime, then that is clearly a problem for society.
If you've been enjoying the conversation so far, don't panic. To catch the rest of the episode, just head over to our Substack at thebrinkpodcast.co.uk.